Louise Peel was 34 years old and had worked at a large supermarket in Coventry for just over 6 years. What happened on the night of the 18th of October 2019 was reconstructed from security camera footage, police dispatch recordings, telephone records, checkout logs, and the investigation that followed. Some parts of the store were outside camera coverage, and several recordings from that night were incomplete. At closing time, only 2 members of staff remained inside the store. Louise was the duty manager. Megan Hughes, a 19-year-old checkout assistant, was cashing up checkout 6. Megan had been seeing Callum Price for several months. Earlier that year, Callum had been caught shoplifting from the supermarket and banned from entering the premises. Staff had also been instructed not to allow him into staff-only areas or pass messages to Megan while she was working. Megan had insisted she knew nothing about the theft. Louise had accepted that and had never raised it with her again. The supermarket closed at 10 o'clock. At 22:16, the camera above customer services showed Louise locking the cigarette cabinet and completing the lottery count. A chilled delivery was expected later that evening, although the driver had called to say he was delayed. Megan was visible on the camera covering checkout 6. She closed her cash drawer, looked briefly towards customer services, and then turned towards something beyond the end of the checkout. A cereal display blocked that part of the store from the camera. Megan remained seated for several seconds. She then removed her headset, placed it beside the till, and stood up. At 22:17, she walked out of view. She did not appear on any of the other cameras. Less than a minute later, Louise left customer services and approached checkout 6. Megan's fleece was hanging over the chair. Her mobile phone was beneath the till, and her cash drawer was open. Audio from the checkout camera recorded Louise calling Megan's name. There was no reply. Louise checked the staff room and toilets first. Cameras then showed her walking through the warehouse and loading bay. She opened the chiller and remained inside for approximately 20 seconds before checking the main frozen food freezer. Megan was not found. The external loading bay door was still locked from the inside. The fire exit system recorded no doors opening after the supermarket closed, and Megan's handbag remained in her locker. At 22:24, Louise returned to checkout 6. As she reached the till, the receipt printer started. A strip of paper passed across the empty conveyor. The receipt, later recovered by police, contained no products, total, or payment information. At the bottom it showed only 22.17. Louise folded it and placed it in her trouser pocket. The supermarket had recently updated its till software. Staff later told police that several checkouts had malfunctioned during the preceding week. At 22:27, Louise used the store telephone to call Megan's mobile. The phone beneath checkout 6 began to vibrate. The recording of Louise's call contains a second ringtone. It was the same melody as Megan's phone, but slower, with each note held for several seconds. It appeared to be coming from household. Louise ended the call. Both ringtones stopped at the same time. A camera covering the main walkway showed Louise picking up Megan's phone and entering household. She passed the cleaning products and washing powders before stopping near pet food. A bottle of washing up liquid was lying open on the floor. Liquid had spread across the tiles. Louise stood there for several seconds, looking towards the warehouse doors. The doors were moving slightly. She called Megan's name and entered the warehouse again. Nothing appeared on the cameras while she was gone. At 22:32, Louise returned to customer services and opened the security recordings. The screen itself was not recorded, but the camera above the desk showed her repeatedly switching between feeds and replaying the footage from checkout 6. Investigators later recovered the same recording. Megan was visible until 22:17. As she passed beyond the cereal display, the picture broke into several black frames. When the image returned, the checkout was empty and the cash drawer was open. In 2 of the damaged frames, a dark shape appeared beyond the display. It may have been a person wearing a dark jacket. Enhancement of the image produced no identifiable face or clothing. Given Callum's ban from the store and his relationship with Megan, police initially considered the possibility that he had entered through an unsecured staff door. They also investigated whether Megan had deliberately moved into a known camera blind spot to meet him. No unsecured entrance was found. At 22:36, Louise called the police. The police dispatch recording captured the conversation. Louise explained that a member of staff had disappeared inside the building and that her coat, handbag and mobile were still there. She confirmed that she had checked the warehouse, toilets, chiller and freezers. The operator asked whether Megan might have left voluntarily. Louise replied, she couldn't have. Every way out would have shown on the panel. The incident was initially recorded as a concern for welfare rather than an immediate threat. No police car was immediately available to attend. After ending the call, Louise rang the branch manager on his mobile. There was no answer. She tried a second time and left a voicemail asking him to call her urgently. The branch manager later confirmed that his phone had been on silent and that he did not hear the message until the following morning. Louise lowered the internal security shutter behind the main entrance and waited at customer services. At 22:41, the store tannoy activated. The first sound was a small electrical click. Then Megan's voice came through the speakers. "Louise?" Louise moved towards the tannoy microphone. "Megan, can you come here? Where are you? Checkout 6. The camera showed Louise looking along the empty checkout line. "Megan, I can't see you. I can see you. Where are you?" There were approximately 4 seconds of silence. Then Megan said, "Behind you." Louise did not turn immediately. The camera above customer services showed the space behind her. It appeared empty. When Louise finally turned, nothing was visible. The tannoy disconnected. Investigators compared the voice with recordings from Megan's mobile phone. They found no obvious difference between them, although the tannoy recording was too poor for a conclusive comparison. Louise attempted to open the main doors. The control panel changed from locked to released, but the doors did not separate. She pressed the emergency release switch and then tried to force the doors apart by hand. They remained closed. The door system was examined the following morning and operated normally. No mechanical fault was found. At 22:43, a scream was recorded by 6 microphones throughout the store. It came from somewhere near the back of the shop floor. The voice appeared to be male. There were no words in it. It began at full volume and continued for just under 3 seconds. Officers who later heard the recording described it as raw and uncontrolled, more consistent with extreme fear than injury or anger. It ended without fading. Louise remained beside the entrance, looking towards the rear of the store. Nothing appeared on the main walkway. Checkout 6 beeped. The receipt printer started again. Louise approached it slowly. The first name printed was Megan Hughes. A second name followed, Edwin James Peel. Louise stood motionless beside the till for almost 20 seconds. The significance of that name was not understood until police spoke to her father. Several years earlier, Louise had created a family tree on genes reunited with him. Edwin Peel had appeared as a suggested relative and was believed to have been her grandfather's older brother. Louise's grandfather had already died, and neither Louise nor her father had previously known that Edwin existed. Her father later asked 2 elderly relatives about him. Both said they knew almost nothing, but their reactions had seemed strange. One changed the subject immediately. The other said Edwin had left home when he was young and refused to discuss him further. Louise had mentioned the Genes reunited story to Megan during a quiet late shift several weeks earlier. James had been the name of Louise's great-grandfather and appeared elsewhere in the family tree. Megan could have remembered it or guessed that it was a family name. The printer added a third name, Louise Peel. Louise tore off the receipt and returned to customer services. From this point, the CCTV recordings became increasingly unreliable. At 22:45, a dark interruption crossed the camera, covering the frozen food section. It lasted less than a second and completely obscured the image. 3 seconds later, the same thing happened in baby care. Another camera failed in wines and spirits. The interruptions did not resemble ordinary signal loss. Each appeared to move across the picture from one side to the other, as though something had passed close to the lens. The direction was different on each camera. Louise watched the monitor while the black frames moved through separate parts of the store. Whenever she looked up from the screen, the shop floor was still. For less than half a second, the Checkout 6 camera showed what appeared to be a seated figure. It was too dark to identify. The figure seemed larger than Megan and may have been male. Its head was lowered and both arms appeared to rest on the checkout. When Louise looked directly towards Checkout 6, the chair was empty. The camera image returned to normal. A second black shape passed behind Louise on the customer services feed. She turned. Nothing was recorded in the space behind her. Megan's mobile rang on the desk. The incoming number was withheld. Louise answered. For 9 seconds there was complete silence. Louise said Megan's name several times. No one answered. The call ended. Police later found no incoming call record on the phone. Several checkout scanners activated. Checkout 6 beeped first. Nothing passed over it. Checkout 4 responded a few seconds later, followed by checkout 7 and then checkout 2. There was no clear pattern. The store remained physically still. The scanners continued to sound at irregular intervals while black interruptions crossed the security cameras. Louise remained behind customer services with her back against the cigarette cabinet. At one point, the monitor showed a dark shape moving through household. Almost immediately, a different camera showed something crossing the warehouse in the opposite direction. Neither image contained enough detail to determine whether the shapes were human. At 22:51, Louise called the police again. This dispatch recording was less clear than the first. Louise was breathing heavily and repeatedly stopped in the middle of her sentences. The operator asked whether she could see anyone inside the store. Louise initially said no. She then tried to explain that something was appearing on different security cameras, but her words became difficult to follow. She sounded terrified and appeared unable to describe what she had seen. At one point she said, "There's someone." She stopped. A checkout scanner sounded nearby. Louise began crying and told the operator that every time she looked directly at the shop floor, there was nobody there. The operator attempted to keep her speaking, but Louise no longer responded clearly. The call remained connected for a further 17 seconds before ending. The second call should have increased the priority of the incident. A later review found that it had not been correctly linked to Louise's earlier report and remained in the dispatch system as a separate incomplete call. Shortly afterwards, the supermarket's internal telephone stopped accepting incoming calls. At 22:54, Louise left customer services. The camera showed her moving quickly towards the warehouse corridor. She was not following anyone visible, but she repeatedly looked behind her as she walked. The camera covering the frozen food section went black just before she entered the main freezer. When the picture returned, the corridor was empty. Louise did not come back out. Approximately 30 seconds later, the bakery camera failed. Before the image cut out, there was a brief movement at the edge of the frame. Investigators could not determine whether it showed a person entering the second freezer. No further movement was recorded in the warehouse corridor. At 1:43, the original incident was reviewed by a dispatcher who noticed that Louise had not called back and that no officer had attended. At approximately 2 o'clock that morning, 2 police officers arrived at the store. The main doors opened normally when the emergency release was used from outside. The shop floor was silent. Checkout 6 was switched on. Megan's fleece remained over the chair, and her mobile was still on the customer services desk. The officers called out and searched the public areas before entering the warehouse. Louise was found inside the main frozen food freezer. She was sitting against the rear wall with her knees drawn towards her chest. Both hands were pressed tightly over her ears. The freezer door was closed but not locked. The internal release worked normally. Nothing obstructed the door, and it could be opened from inside with little force. Louise had no visible injuries. Callum Price was found in a separate freezer beside the bakery preparation area. He was lying on the floor close to the door. That door was also closed but unlocked. Its internal release was working, and there was no sign that Callum had been restrained. Nobody could establish how Callum entered the supermarket. His car was found almost a mile away with his phone and house keys inside. No camera recorded him approaching the store, and none of the doors registered an entry. The male scream recorded at 22:43 could not be conclusively identified as Callum's voice. Post-mortem examinations found no injury or substance that would explain why Louise and Callum had remained inside the freezers. Both deaths were attributed to prolonged exposure to cold. Neither freezer showed signs of an attempt to escape. There were no damaged handles, marks around the doors, or injuries to their hands. Investigators concluded that Louise and Callum had entered the separate freezers voluntarily. They could not explain why neither had opened the door again. Megan was not found inside the store. Her coat, handbag and mobile were recovered, but no camera showed her leaving the building. There were no confirmed sightings of her after 22:17. Police investigated Callum's possible involvement in her disappearance, but his death and the lack of evidence left that line of inquiry unresolved. The final receipt from Checkout 6 contained 4 names: Megan Hughes, Edwin James Peel, Louise Peel, Callum Price. No reliable record of Edwin James Peel was found during the original investigation. Years later, Louise's father located a newspaper notice from November 1964. It concerned the disappearance of a 26-year-old Coventry man named Edwin James Peel. He had left his family home one evening and had not been seen again. No body was recovered. The cause of the black interruptions on the cameras was never identified. Engineers found no fault with the recording equipment, till system, tannoy or door controls. The footage was retained as evidence. Most of it shows an apparently empty supermarket. In the final usable frame from checkout 6, the chair is empty. The cereal display blocks the end of the checkout. Behind it, close to the floor, there is a small area of darkness that does not appear in any earlier recording. It may be a fault in the image. It may also be part of someone's shoe. Megan Hughes has never been found.